Welcome to this week's lesson about business ethics. Here we're going to just touch a little bit about the different types of ethics and possible conflicts that might arise while you're conducting your own business. Before we begin, don't forget to refer to the helpful handouts that I have posted on Blackboard. This week's handout for this particular lesson for business ethics looks like this. If you'd like to take a moment, go ahead and grab it, print it, and refer to it throughout this lesson. Let's begin with defining the term ethics. Most people would define it as knowing the difference between right and wrong. Others would call it moral principles, your moral compass, so to speak. Others would define it as your personal values, what keeps you true to yourself. And those are all correct. Except now when we apply it towards a business, we look at it as keeping those moral principles and values while conducting your business. Now, is all unethical behavior illegal? No, you can still conduct legal acts, but they still be unethical. It's important in your business that you set the right ethical tone. So how might one set a positive ethical tone in your business? Well, there's several different ways. One would be to lead by example. You certainly don't want to go by the do as I say, not as I do approach if you want to have a positive attitude in your business. So set the tone by leading by example, having a good example for your team or for your employees to follow will certainly put your business ahead of others and promote the good values and the principles that you want to portray in your business. Another way that you could do that would be creating a code of conduct, something that's in writing that your employees can peruse or even look through and have signed saying that they've read them and gone through. It's important for your employees to know what your expectations are, and one way to do that is to have it in writing in a code of conduct. Another way might be to have training programs. Anyone have to go through sexual harassment training programs at your workplace now? Well, that is certainly one way to create a positive and ethical environment by creating training programs so that employees can have a visual context of what's okay and what's not okay. So training programs is a great way to set that ethical tone in your business. Another way might be to provide incentives. This is your positive reinforcement sort of avenue where you can create incentives for employees based on their good behavior. The better they perform and the more ethics they have and lead by their example or what have you would create an incentive, and rewarding that behavior is certainly a good way to set that tone. And most importantly is to always have a good attitude. Always have a positive approach when you're talking to your employees, whether it has to be bad news or anything like that. Having a positive attitude and always starting with a positive is a great way to set that ethical tone in your business. Now, there is another way to set the tone in your business, and we're going to explore that next. Another example of a way to set your ethical tone in your business is going to require that we take a look at a story. And this story begins back in 1989. Yep, way up there in Alaska. I don't know if you could tell from my beautiful drawing that was Alaska. We're going to put little Sarah Palin up there just for fun. She's looking over here at another country. Anyway, this story begins at about midnight or so on March 24th, 1989. And it is about a ship that is making its way into a very narrow harbor in Alaska at Prince William Sound, Alaska. Now, anybody recognize the name of the ship? It is called the Exxon Valdez. Now, the Exxon Valdez is the largest tanker in the fleet at the time, and it is making its way to Prince William Sound, Alaska, with a full hull of oil. The captain, whose name is Joe Hazelwood, decides that he wants to take a little break. And he wants to go down to his cabin and, make love to his gin and tonic. Well, while Joe is down in his cabin, he doesn't leave his first mate in charge. He doesn't leave his second mate in charge. He leaves his third mate in charge, who's been at the helm of the ship working with him, with the captain, for several long hours and is probably quite sleep deprived. Anyway, as he's making his way into the reef, unfortunately, they run aground and they hit Bligh Reef, and oil just starts going everywhere. Just all over the coastline. Well, this happened in the middle of the night. So let's say that you're the CEO of this business, or let's just say you're even the captain of the ship. What's the first thing that you're going to do when your ship runs aground and it starts leaking oil all over the ocean and off the coast of Alaska? Well, those are all fabulous guesses, but you probably should call your CEO, and your CEO should probably get out there and assess the situation. Well, unfortunately, they took their time going out and assessing the situation. As a matter of fact, I think the record states that the CEO didn't even get out there for at least 24 hours after the oil spill to see what was going on. Now, as the oil was spewing, this became a huge disaster, and to the extent that some say that it spilled up to 30 million gallons of oil into the ocean, covering 11,000 square miles of coastline and ocean, and 13 miles of 1,300 miles, of actual coastline. So, needless to say, it was quite tragic. The loss of sea life was very sad. It was about a couple dozen killer whales. There were a few hundred seals that were killed, a few thousand sea otters, billions of fish and salmon eggs and herring, and a couple 100,000 seabirds were killed as a result of the oil spill. Now, being in Alaska, what is their primary livelihood, particularly down here on the coastline where the accident took place? Well, it would be fishing. Has anybody ever had Alaskan king salmon? Well, unfortunately, these fishermen that were all along the coast lost everything. They lost everything, and resulted in bankruptcies and divorces, and unfortunately a couple of suicides as a result of the disaster that has now hit their lives. Well, when Exxon Valdez hit the reef and come to find out that Joseph Hazelwood, the captain, had gone down to his cabin, there was some investigation. Well, it turns out that Joe Hazelwood was a known alcoholic. He had been in rehab before. He had a suspended license for a DUI, and that Exxon knew about it. Well, what do you suppose Alaska did after this disaster? Because they didn't clean up very well after this disaster either. Unfortunately, they just weren't ready like they were promised to be ready. An oil pipeline goes down the middle of Alaska. And when Exxon was negotiating with Alaska to put this pipeline in, they promised Alaska that their ships were going to be double-hulled, they were going to have safety protocols in place, they were going to have maintenance and inspections regularly, and they were going to have the reaction set in place if there happened to be a disaster. Well, none of that came to be. The ships weren't double-hulled, and the safety protocols that they had supposedly in place were not in place. They didn't have anything on the docks to help minimize the amount of oil that was reaching the coast, and come to find out after some investigation, they weren't regularly inspecting and maintaining the ships at all. So the state of Alaska, what do you suppose they do? Well, they sue Exxon. Of course they do. So they sue Exxon in federal court, and the first thing they do is they go to the trial court, and the jury awards the state of Alaska and all of the thousands of plaintiffs. There's about 14,000 plaintiffs involved in this case. And they sue in the court, and the court, or the jury comes out with $287 million in what we call compensatory damages. And we'll go over those damages much more when we get into torts, but $287 million in compensatory damages. Compensatory damages, again, are damages that are designed to compensate the injured parties. So that's how they were allocating that money. Now remember, again, there's lots of plaintiffs here. Now, not only did they impose compensatory damages, they also gave all the plaintiffs $5 billion in punitive damages. Punitive damages are designed to punish the defendant, hoping that they won't do this again. So that's $5 billion, which was equal to 1 year's profit at the time for Exxon. Well, did I say 14,000? I mean 33,000 plaintiffs. I'm sorry. The Exxon felt that these punitive damages were too much, and so they sued and they appealed up to the Ninth Circuit, because that is the next court that you can appeal to in the federal system. So they go to the Ninth Circuit Appellate Court, and the Ninth Circuit says, oh, well, you know, you're right, $5 billion, that's a little bit too much, so we're going to remand this back down and tell the trial court they need to lower it to $4 billion. Well, $4 billion was too much also still for Exxon, so they appeal it again. They appeal it again, and it goes up to the Ninth Circuit, and they say, oh, our mistake, I'm sorry, my mistake, it should have been $4.5 billion. Well, Exxon didn't like that much either, so of course, what did they do? They appealed it again, and this time the Ninth Circuit says, oh, yeah, okay, we see what you're saying there. So I guess based on some law, we're going to lower it down to $2.5 billion. Exxon still didn't like that, and so they appealed it again. And this time it goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court looks at the case, and it looks at the punitive damages. Now, the only issue that they're appealing throughout this entire process is the punitive damages. Only the $5 billion punitive damages is what Exxon is appealing, not the compensatory damages, but the $5 billion punitive damages. They're saying the court erred in imposing these punitive damages. And it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Well, to back up a little bit, I did mention that Exxon Valdez knew that Joseph Hazelwood was an alcoholic. Well, that was very important because normally in these type of accident cases, whether it's on this huge scale of an oil spill or a smaller scale of a car accident, punitive damages are not generally allowed because their purpose is to punish the defendant. And you don't punish people for negligence or, just being stupid and results in an accident. But in this case, Alaska knowingly hired an alcoholic. And that was not just regular negligence, that was beyond negligence. That was what we call gross negligence, which means Exxon was being reckless. And that warranted the $5 billion in punitive damages. So that's what they appealed. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court lowered the punitive damages to $507 million. So they went down from $5 billion down to $507.5 million. For 33,000 plaintiffs, that comes out to about 15 grand a person. $15,000 for their whole livelihood having been destroyed because of this oil spill. Now, the other reason why I'm telling you this is because the whole process took quite a bit of time. The accident was in 1989. They didn't actually go to trial court till 1994. And the United States Supreme Court, that was in 2008. So they spent all those years in the court system, this case did. And at the very end, the plaintiffs got $15,000 each. Now, that was just in punitive damages that they got. And I guess if you count interest, it might come out to about 30 grand each, but still that's not very much money for having lost everything. So what is the moral of the story? Why am I telling you so much about this particular case? Well, one, Exxon's reaction to this was deplorable. They really did not get on top of it. They probably could have minimized the amount of damage that resulted as an oil spill had they gotten on top of it a little bit more and had all these protocols in place. It might not have been as bad as it turned out to be. Even the cleanup efforts were not very advantageous because they went out and they had people out on the coastline with pressure washers and they're spraying the rocks and they're even getting little brushes out and scrubbing off the rocks. Well, what happens when the tide comes back in? The tide comes back in and there you go. Now it's all covered with oil again. And then they would start all over again and start spray washing or pressure washing all the rocks off again. Wasn't very productive, but that's what they were doing at the time. Then when they were pressure washing, they added this dispersant into it so that it would break up the oil. Well, now, years later, they find out that the dispersant that they were using was toxic. So now those people that volunteered and went out to help pressure wash all those rocks are now suffering from respiratory illnesses. Now, here, years later, all these people are still, unfortunately, suffering as a result of the spill. The herring eggs never came back. The salmon began to slowly come back, and the other wildlife started to come back, but I don't believe the herring ever have come back yet. So, needless to say, the entire thing was quite tragic and could have been avoided. Now, what is the moral of this story? Well, the moral of the story is don't hire an alcoholic, basically. And what I mean by that is that you should not look the other way. You knew that your captain was an alcoholic, and you hired him anyway. And as a result, we have this huge disaster having taken place. So the moral of this story, and if I were to ask you on an exam, the moral of the story is do not look the other way. Know what's going on in your business. Know what's happening. You cannot just turn a blind eye to the things that are going on in your business. So the moral of this whole story is do not look the other way. Do not look the other way. That's the moral of the story. There are going to be times in your business where you're going to find yourself in a conflict and have to make some tough choices. Those can arise in a number of different ways. The first thing that you'll probably be thinking about is the trade-offs in your business. What are you willing to give up and what are you willing to keep to maintain your ethical value at the same time having a successful business? Those kinds of things are going to come up probably more often than you think. Another particular conflict that might arise would be constitutional issues. For example, you may have someone who has a religious concern with regard to working on certain days or taking certain days off, or perhaps the way they dress or things like that with religious factors involved, and you may have to decide whether or not you want to allow that to take place in your business and to represent your business. So would you be willing to not hire someone because of their religious feelings or any other constitutional factors like their freedom of speech or freedom of press or anything like that? And that's a concern that you might have, and you have to be willing to consider whether or not that's someone you want to represent in your business and to what extent. Now, not hiring someone based on religion is not okay in the sense that that can't be the reason that you don't hire them, or more importantly, that is the reason that you fire them. It is more so a consideration when you're dealing with how it's going to affect your business rather than discriminating against their beliefs to begin with. Which brings us again to the hiring and firing of employees. You may find yourself in a situation where a friend is going to come to you and say, hey, I'm in some tough times. I really could use some help. Could you give me a job? And you're going to come into a conflict of whether or not you are willing to hire your friend over perhaps another more qualified individual. And that's a conflict that you're going to have to deal with at that time while maintaining your moral principles and ethical values. Another way that a conflict might arise in your business would be a cost-benefit analysis. What are you willing to spend in order to succeed, and where do you cut those costs? Those are all different types of conflicts that you're going to have to consider while conducting your business while maintaining your ethical value. And just so that it's not going to be easy, but it's also things that you can think about now and think about the best ways that you would handle it should you be in that situation. Unfortunately, not all businesses, and particularly bigger organizations, maintain good value sense. Their moral principles being compromised and their ethical values non-existent, you find ourselves in an age of quite a few scandals. You could tell, if you remember, from Enron, where they sort of misrepresented their accounting books when they were really headed towards bankruptcy, but they misrepresented to their shareholders that they were making quite a bit of money, and that didn't work out so well for them. And with regard to Tyco and MCI, both having taken money from the business and again hiding it and misrepresenting it to their shareholders. And again with IamClone, we remember Martha Stewart. Now, as a result of all these types of scandals and this misbehavior from these companies and their officers, we find ourselves in a new law that was taken place by Mr. Sarbanes and Mr. Oxley, which has now become known as the SOX Act. As I said, as a result of the ongoing scandals by some of these very large businesses, Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. better known as SOX. Now, some of the things that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act did was really tighten the reins up on the accounting firms and the auditing that takes place in some of these businesses. For example, in Enron, it was the accountants and the auditors that were held responsible because they decided that they were going to destroy documents that showed that they were sort of turning a blind eye to the accounting and the misrepresentation of available money in that company. So as a result, we have the SOX Act, and some of the things that the SOX Act did was, first, they created an oversight board. It's an independent oversight board of public accounting firms that provide auditing services. This then requires that these auditors get registered and they defined new processes and procedures for compliance, making sure that there's a quality control involved over some of these auditors. Another thing the SOX Act did was establish standards for these external auditor independence to limit conflicts of interest. So you couldn't necessarily have the people that are preparing your taxes also handle auditing. So SOX requires that there be independent auditors in these companies. Another aspect of SOX Act was corporate responsibility. It requires that the senior executives take individual responsibility for the accuracy and completeness of their financial reports. In Enron, they were trying to say that the CEO and the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, really didn't know what was going on. And SOX says, you should know what's going on in your own business, and we're going to hold you personally responsible for any financial reports, and we're going to require that you sign them. The next aspect of SOX is financial disclosures, which requires that reporting take place for financial transactions, including off-balance sheet transactions of all the corporate officers. So they're keeping an eye out on what the officers are doing while they're conducting business and how they're handling their transactions. The corporate and criminal fraud accountability has to do with criminal penalties for destruction and interference with any type of investigation. No cover-ups. So SOX is intended to be a little bit more stern and firm with regard to any type of interference with investigations and protecting whistleblowers at the same time. So SOX Act provides much more protection for those people that are called whistleblowers when they can't go to their bosses to report bad behavior, but now they have a requirement that there be an anonymous whistleblowing effort in place to protect those people that would like to report bad behavior on the account of their bosses. The enhancement for penalties is certainly a deterrent. It increases those penalties for conspiracies and it allows for stronger sentencing for any type of misbehavior, like misrepresenting your books to your stockholders. And finally, the tax returns, again, as I mentioned before, SOX requires that these chief executive officers sign the tax returns themselves so that they will take personal responsibility for what happens there. So those are some of the highlights of the SOX Act of 2002. Now, there are going to be other people that you come into contact with that you might have to then be aware of what their professional responsibilities are. So let's take a look at those. One of the professionals that you will probably come into contact with through the course of your business operations is an accountant. Now, accountants are generally certified by the Board of Accountancy here in California. But we have to look at what the professional responsibility standard of care is used for an accountant. In other words, what is the standard that we hold them to maintain their professional responsibility to their clients? Here we look at the Reasonably Prudent Person Standard, the RPP standard. Now you're going to hear me say that quite a bit throughout the course of the semester. But basically in this context, the Reasonably Prudent Person Standard for an accountant is what would an accountant do in the same or similar circumstances? So if you were an accountant and you were presented with a certain situation, what would most accountants do in that situation? That is the RPP standard. Now, the accountants are governed by GAAP and GAAS, generally accepted accounting principles and generally accepted auditing standards. Basically, these particular standards define what a reasonably prudent accountant would do in certain circumstances. So it is helpful that you have these type of standards to be able to define what is appropriate for an accountant to do. So if I were to ask you a question like, what is the standard of care for accountants? Your answer would be that of a reasonably prudent accountant using GAAP and GAAS. Another professional that you may come into contact with during your business operation is an attorney. Now, the standard of care for attorneys is also based on a reasonably prudent person standard. Now, believe it or not, attorneys do have ethics, and we do have a particular professional responsibility to our clients. Those are defined at the State Bar of California, and you could even go to their website and click on our Rules of Professional Responsibility to see the standards that attorneys need to have and the due diligence that we have to use in protecting our clients. So believe it or not, we do have ethics. You know, attorneys don't usually lose that ethical value until after they become attorneys, because prior to becoming an attorney, after taking that horrible 3-day exam that we have to take, the bar exam, to become attorneys, we also have to undergo a background check, but we also have to file an application for moral character. So we go under a bit of scrutiny as they delve into our lives, and we have to prove our moral character prior to becoming an attorney. So once we practice law, once we've passed the bar and we've been sworn in as attorneys, we can practice pretty much any area of law that we want to, but we still have to practice it with professional responsibility. Now, believe it or not, we do have to keep secrets. We have a duty of confidence and towards our client, which means that anytime our client tells us something just between the attorney and the client, anything the client says is confidential. So that means you could come to me, and please don't do this, but you could come to me and sit in my office and say, wow, I don't know what to do. I just killed my spouse and buried her in the backyard. Well, I can't tell anyone that. I cannot tell anyone that you just told me that. That's part of our duty of confidentiality. Now, if you came to me and said you were going to kill your spouse and bury her in the backyard, then I have a different duty. The California rules require that I use my judgment in first trying to dissuade you from doing that. So I have to say, no, don't do that. But I also have a choice. I can either report you to the authorities or I keep it quiet. Now, the California rules is unique in the United States because California says we may rat you out. And if we did, it's not a breach of our confidentiality duty. But we don't have to. That's what makes California unique and different from all the other 50 states. The standard of care for an attorney is that of a general practitioner with the same skill, experience, and knowledge. Now, that basically means that we don't have additional special skills that we take additional testing for. So once we graduate law school and we pass the bar exam and we're sworn in as attorneys, like I said, we can practice any law that we want, with the exception of patent law or tax law, because for those we have to take a separate exam. But we would be general practitioners, so we could practice family law or criminal law or personal injury law or medical malpractice or what have you. But for our professional responsibility standard of care, we're held to that standard of a general practitioner with the same skill, experience, and knowledge. Now, if we do decide to get certified in a particular area, then of course our standard goes up. You would assume that if somebody went through special training to get additional certifications that you should hold them to a higher standard than somebody who does not have that particular skill set. So you would hold those people, those attorneys, to a higher standard. And then, as I indicated before, in California, you can go to the State Bar website and you can find our rules of professional responsibility right there for you, so you can see all the wonderful things and our ethics that we have to follow. And that concludes the lesson regarding business ethics. Just to sum up, we talked about the definition of ethics, the difference between right and wrong, moral principles, and values. We took a look at setting the right ethical tone in your business. And don't forget the moral of the story for the Exxon Valdez case: do not look the other way. We talked about some conflicts that you might have to face during the operation of your business. And we took a look at what happens when you're not so ethical in your business, and which resulted in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. Then we talked a little bit about the professional responsibility of accountants, and then concluded with the professional responsibilities of your attorneys that you may need to hire during the course of your operation of your business. And that concludes the lesson for this week.